Hello, everybody, and a warm welcome to the Lockdown LitFest. We hope you're keeping safe, we hope you're being well, and we hope you are staying careful. Murray Lachlan Young is a British poet, stand-up performer, broadcaster, a playwright, a screenwriter, and a children's author who came to prominence during the Britpop era of the mid-1990s, when he became the only poet to sign a recording contract worth £1 million. His early shows, he supported such acts as Julian Cope, The Pretenders, and Dita Von Teese on the music and cabaret circuit in London. And live stand-up poetry has been a key part of his career, so much so that Tom Hodgkinson, editor of the Idler magazine, wrote, "Murray is both an actor and a wit, a poet who can perform and a performer who can write poetry, all rolled into one." He's appeared everywhere, from Glastonbury to the MTV Music Awards, from the Wilderness Festival to Brighton, from Latitude to Port Eliot. And he's been poet in residence everywhere in the BBC and a lot of other places beside, which we will discuss. Please give a very warm welcome to Murray Lachlan Young. Murray, it's lovely to have you here at the Lockdown LitFest. First of all, where are we talking to you from? How have you been coping with lockdown?
Well, thank you for having me. Lovely to see you, Paul. It seems only about 10 years ago, even though it was only a year ago, that we were sitting around a campfire somewhere in Kent. But I'm here in Lewes, staying at my ex's house, looking after my two sons, one is 20 and the other one's just about to be 16. And lockdown was a very interesting experience. Yes, it was for everybody. For me, it was a really interesting journey, and I did huge amounts of work. And I suppose the interesting thing to start off with was that it got me off the road, and I'd been touring with a play that I'd written and was performing in, called The Mystery of the Radlesham Mumps, and I'd got so tired of being on the road, and we had a tour coming up, and as much as I loved the piece, I was deeply knackered, and the thought of not doing it was, and also then dealing with my writing slate was a great feeling, and just to be at home for a while. And I think it's something that when one travels so much as a performer, it's very easy to I mean, I get to the point where I don't know where I am when I wake up in my own bed, and that's the traveling performer. I think anyone who travels for their work ends up feeling like that, and it's just lovely to get a bit of routine back in life for me.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that. You made mention of dealing with your writing slate. For those who may not be familiar what a writing slate is, i.e. me, what does that mean? What do you do?
Well, I've got a backlog of stuff that needs writing, and some of it is and it sits in various different incarnations of packed and unpackedness. And so, as a writer, when you start on a piece of work, there's a huge unpacking process of the idea, and in unpacking, so I can imagine going into a room which is the idea, and all of the ideas within the main premise are thrown around on the floor, and the best thing to do is to throw them all onto the bed, and then then put them in their relevant drawers, or take them out and examine them and deal with them in various different ways. But the problem is, and I think it's the same for all writers, is that the moment you leave that thing, it starts to all jump back into, let's say, a suitcase, and then the suitcase packs itself up again. And then for the writers to then restart, there's this huge process of unpacking everything again and again. And it has its benefits in some ways, because it makes one look at the material again. But there's a sort of, there has to be a feeling of momentum in writing. And so I had various different pieces which were in various different states of packed and unpackedness, and that was a screenplay that needed to be finished off, a screenplay that was on its second draft start of, a multi-platform piece that is going to be a 10,000 word verse poem, an augmented reality exercise, 6 podcasts, and a theatre play. plus my new collection of verse, which is long overdue. So all of these things just sitting there, growing bigger and growing scales. I could actually then start taking them one at a time and dealing with them, and that's been a really good feeling.
Sounds like a hell of a workload, Murray. There's a
Yeah,
thing. I mean, I don't know, but when I write, and there's so many of the authors that I spoke to, when they say they write these, sometimes the ideas just come to you, and if you don't get them down, then they disappear really quickly. And then when you do write them down, unless you work on them, then you kind of forget the full scope and scale of them. It's like these things gift themselves to the interior of your head, and it's a race to write them down for fear that you'll forget where you were going to, or those fantastic turns of phrases. I can see you nodding your head. This is something you recognize?
yeah. I think it's something like seeing a cat, knowing it's a cat, and then stroking it. So there's 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 a feeling of the tactile and the immediacy
Yeah.
that exists within something. That if it's, I think there's the premise, of course, which can be clear, and then one goes over that with pitching it to friends or back to oneself, etc., etc. But the zest, the real feeling, the defining principle of a piece of writing that is felt internally, I think that is the thing that disappears if it's left. And then to believe, it's a bit like you hear musicians, they'll come up with a brilliant tune, they'll wake up in the night, the classic with Keith Richards with I Can't Get No Satisfaction,
Yeah.
woke up and he heard it in his head, and then he recorded it, and then he woke up the next day and he knew what it was because of the melody. And it's the same thing for musicians. If they don't record that melody, which is the essence of everything that their song is about, and remember the single hook line, I can't get no satisfaction, then the song's lost. And I think obviously you move into long form, then it's a more complex set of issues, but the basic facts remain the same, I think.
That makes sense. That's well described. Can I take you back to start points? You were born in Washington, D.C., grew up in Sevenoaks, went to the beautifully named Wilderness School, but then you went to Salford University for a degree in media performance. What was that, and what led you to it? It strikes me that was as the result of a will to perform, as a will to do something, as a will to be a creative. Is that where it came from?
Yeah, well, my parents moved to Kuwait when I was 19, so home left me,
Right.
and I hadn't planned on doing any higher education because I was full of beans and thought I was going to do whatever I wanted to do anyway. And then I moved to London and became a cycle courier, and thought that London was just going to open up before me, and it was just overwhelming. So I then went off to work on a farm for 9 months, and after that 9 months, I realised that higher education would be a really good thing for me to ground myself in. And media performance was just something that caught my eye, and it was the first year that they were doing it there, and they've gone on to become very successful doing it at Salford University. And what it was writing and performing and across multi channels and platforms, which is what I still do, and that's where it all came from. And even the writing of verse poetry was part of what I was doing there. And making films, producing, directing plays, writing scripts, and just becoming somebody who could be light-footed within the the arts, really, or the performing arts, and the writing side of it for me was something that was a slow starter due to being. I don't know exactly where I am on the dyslexic scale, but I was dyslexic before we were allowed to call it that. I was just thick for a while, at school, and just couldn't make words sit together. So being able to exist on an oral level within um, writing was the way that I started. And so I would say not really being able to read or write properly till after 10 years old, and not able to read out loud until probably with any confidence till late 20s. That's how I came to be interested in the spoken word, because
Okay.
it was the only thing that I felt really confident in doing. And through writing in a spoken word format, I became able to then, with the aid of spell check and word processing, I became able to, and doing BBC Radio 4 Saturday Live, which was an intense discipline. I don't know anybody knows about that, but that's how I became able to actually write.
Just give me 1 sec. Somebody started mowing outside. Forgive me. That should keep the noises off down. Sorry about that. I'm intrigued by this because you have such a fantastic facility with words, such a fantastic playfulness and inventiveness with the use of words for getting your message across. It took you until your late 20s. I mean, were you not a reader as a child? Your vocabulary is extraordinary. I mean, and the links you make are just so inventive and so. I mean, you've sort of defined the medium in a way. Was this struggled for, or was was this a process, or was this a switch when suddenly you found this brilliant means and mode of communication that suited you?
Well, it was a combination of the two. So I was lucky enough to have a mother that read a lot of verse, novels, etc. to me as a child. So I was deeply involved in the world of children's literature through it being read to me and listening to it on records, etc., etc. And went to a very violent school, and so had to get and also was a very late developer. So I hit puberty very late. So I went from being a sort of sports star as a child, to suddenly being a boy when everyone else had turned into men in my year group. And as a result of which, I went from being somebody who could look after himself, who's suddenly physically very vulnerable from people, from great hulking blokes. So I had to then learn how to get. I mean, I think I was always pretty good at talking, but I had to get a lot better at talking to get out of certain situations. So I think that was that was part of it. And then I did have the writer's epiphany, probably around about the age of 24. I think I came out of Salford, came to London, and started doing this performance game show, which so for my dissertation, I studied stardom and wrote a paper on stardom, and I thought I'd see if I could make it work. And I played an exorcist, Father Barry, in The Devils at Edinburgh, and seemed to develop some sort of supernatural powers. I think I've looked into it since, and I think it was through the exercising of expulsion of negativity on a daily basis, playing a demented exorcist, exorcising nuns twice a day and walking around dressed as a priest for nearly 4 weeks, carrying a huge golden cross made out of the mirror ball of the Hacienda nightclub in Manchester. And um, and I had people come to me on the street, sort of asking me to bless them, and it all got really kind of bizarre. And then it all just disappeared when the show was over. But I felt like I could lay my hands on people, and I think it's from that thing that if you expel negativity from yourself until you are completely positive, you start to shine. And I think that's what happened. And I was sort of, but so I developed this character anyway. So the character then came to London, and we started this performance art game show based on the game Twister. And the idea, I then took these masked characters, because within my dissertation I'd worked out that the only way that it is safe to be famous is to wear a mask, in the Greek sense of these things. And so I created masked characters for that reason with a friend, and I said, look, I've been studying how to be famous, and shall we give it a go? So we did, and we got friends to follow us around with flash cameras wherever we went in these nightclubs. And as I predicted, it attracted all the other press. So they then started photographing us, and then these characters became sort of overnight stars within the sort of, Time Out and Evening Standard and all that sort of stuff. And then we sort of both realized, this was my friend Tom Mortimer and I, we both realized that we had limited lifespan, because in the end, once we'd got all this fame, we didn't really know what to do with it apart from lurk around in nightclubs being paid not very much money and getting drunk a lot and other things. And so we realized that the only thing you could do would be to be successful in that world would be to be a DJ. So we used to carry a bag of records around, and one day a DJ didn't show up, and we threw these records on. Everyone started dancing, and Sarah Blonstein, who was the whose room it was at the time, said, I think it was Saturday Night Fever we had, and then we just took it off, and everyone started booing. And she came and said, "Darling, what are you all doing in here?" And we said, "Well, we're not playing anymore until you give us a residency for this much money a week." And amid the booing, she said, "Yes, okay, fine." Anyway, so bearing in mind, before this, I'd been writing a lot of the verse poetry at college, and I was going around speaking it in people's ears as my other job. And so wherever I was, I'd be, being a desperate performer. I was in any circumstances desiring to be the center of attention and to share my work. And so the DJing thing got to a point where we realized that we weren't actually DJs. We were just two blokes who picked up a record and put it on a record deck. And there was a little bit more to DJing than that. And but even we managed to push it. We opened the Sky TV and Dazed and Confused, and had a residency at the Ministry of Sound. And we never really worked out why they let us do it, but they did. And so that ended when we realized it was over. And then I did a gig at Ronnie Scott's, where I arrived and was pushed down the stairs by the sound man for asking if I could mic up a cellist. Unheard of in Ronnie Scott's.
Of course.
Anyway, so I then had a gig there where I did some various different bits and pieces, and there was a huge reaction to it. And it was a kind of half of the Exorcist. So it was the intense energy of the Exorcist, which I could still do things with crowds with. And there was a record company there, and they said, "Oh, would you like to come and see us? We'd like to see if we could turn this into a record." And they were Almo Sounds, which was the new reincarnation, or the reincarnation of A&M Records, Herb Albert and Jerry Moss. And so I started talking to them, but at the same time I started seriously writing long pieces about it, 8.5 minutes long, and they just started flowing. And it was very much, the story that you hear from a lot of writers, where it's like there's someone else in the room. It's like there's a presence, and that all you have to do is hold the pen, and this stuff comes out. And it was just flowing and flowing and flowing. And then and my performances became more and more popular until I was selling out Ronnie Scott's on my own. And then the Pet Shop Boys called up and said, "Do you want to come and support us at the Savoy Theatre?" And then MTV contacted me and said, "Would you like your own series on MTV USA?" And then the record deal struck, and then that record deal went down. And then I went to see a friend of mine at EMI and said, and oh yes, and I had a tailor who appeared, a mad tailor who appeared, a Savile Row tailor, who said, "I'm going to put these clothes on you." And he made these sort of quite Edwardian looking, maybe not even Edwardian, I'd say sort of more like William and Mary, or Regency, possibly not quite Regency, a little bit more austere. But he was a huntsman trained tailor, and he made these suits which were just they created more energy around me than had I gone down the street with a dressed as the most extreme form of punk you could imagine. They were so like long coats and chocolate brown pinstriped trousers and chalk striped trousers, etc. So I turned into this sort of character, which he came to my house, and he knocked on the door, and I didn't really know who he was. And I opened the door, and he put this enormous joint in my mouth and lit it. walked straight past me into the room, then pulled out an effigy he'd made of me with some sort of peculiar thing that he lit a candle under. And then these words of Byron started, it was a, I don't know what you call it, a sort of projector. And he started projecting the words of Byron, just started circling all around the room. And then he produced a silk waistcoat with handmade buttons with the words of Byron written all over it, and said, "This is for you, and I'm going to make your clothes." so it was this sort of magical stuff happening everywhere. But the record deal with Alma didn't work out for one reason or other. There was a few problems. So I went to see a friend at EMI, and I said, "Look, I don't know what to do." And then the next minute, this enormous record deal was happening. And because when you do a record deal, there's a development list. I think it's like most industries. There's the people that we're keeping an eye on, and we think that they might be something, but we're just going to see how it plays out. And then there's the people who are on the priority break list, the one that everyone's excited about. And I realized I was on that list, and then it all just went completely crazy. And I was at the Glastonbury Festival, 96, I think.
Yes, 96 to present day, except 2015.
Well, 97 maybe, possibly. I don't know, and then it broke. And so, and these people had got me a gig on the main stage at Glastonbury. So I walked out on the main stage at Glastonbury, which nobody, I think Heathcote Williams is the only other person to have done it. And I think it was a smaller festival when he did it, but nonetheless, it was the pyramid stage. So not taking anything away from Heathcote. So I walked out onto the main stage and did my gig. And I was at that sort of stage where it was all perfectly normal to do a gig at the main stage at Glastonbury, and I'd done the main stage in Glasgow at Tea in the Park. And I came off, and somebody held up the front page of the Daily Telegraph, and it said, "Young poet signs £1 million record deal," and there's a big picture of my face on the front page. And then down the side column was the lyrics to "Simply Everyone's Taking Cocaine." And that's how the whole thing broke. And I looked and I thought, wow, I have. Because I think the thing is, that's where my arrogant ideas of being somebody, because I'd done a thesis on stardom, I knew how the media worked. Of course I did. I knew everything about the media, and look what I've done, and look what I've created through my amazing understanding of media and my magical practices. But of course, I was a very young man, and I didn't realize exactly but I did, though. I knew for that moment that I've lost control of the story here. I don't know what's going to happen to me. I'm jumping off a cliff. And I knew I was in terrible danger at that moment. And I just thought, well, why not? And I had no choice anyway, because it had happened. The button had been pushed, and Mark Bukowski called me and said, "Look, this is going to be huge. It's going completely berserk." And then the next minute, there were newspaper headlines from all around the world, and I was being called up by the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and places. It was in the Philippines, and it had been syndicated by Reuters.
Mm-hmm.
And I woke up and there was paparazzi outside my house, and I was suddenly the record company putting me in a limousine, and I was driving around a limousine, and that was the sort of high point that it was. And then I remember being invited to Andrew Lloyd Webber's house and to do his private festival at Sidmonton, and sitting next to the then Director General of the BBC, John Burt.
Yes.
And he said to me, "Have you done anything with the BBC?" And I said, "Well, I've done a few bits and pieces. I've done Kaleidoscope, and I've done et cetera, et cetera." And he said, "Well, you will be doing a lot more." And then about a week later, these people called up and said, "You've got your own special on BBC Two, and we saw you at the Edinburgh Festival." And I thought, well, of course, I had nothing to do with John Burt saying you will be working more for the BBC. So it was stuff like that happening, which, and it was happening at such a pace. And then there were pluggers and PR people.
Murray, let me ask you, sorry to interrupt, but that's a really good 15-minute biography on the high spots. Was it all enjoyable? I mean, you set this up, you created it. this fed into your thesis. You were putting your thesis into practice, as you said. Was it all enjoyable, or was that always sort of that feeling of sort of flying without a safety net aspect to it?
Well, you couldn't have put it better, really. I mean, that was the feeling, and that's where it went, and that's where suddenly. And I think the thing is, when you look at the way that media works, a good story can only last for a certain amount of time before it needs to grow new legs or a set of wings. So it's got good legs, then it needs wings, and then it needs to mutate. And they always say within media, and you see this a lot within the way that you get a lot of trashy stories happening. But I think it works in politics and in everything that a story has to mutate to stay relevant. And so as long as someone has a trajectory, which is something I didn't know at the time, as long as there is a trajectory, whether that trajectory is up or down, it doesn't matter. The story will continue. But the only way you can prevent the story from happening is if you starve it of oxygen. So we all know, I'm sure all of them think of numerous examples of both of those things, to the point where you have soap stars deliberately getting themselves caught doing a sex tape or a coke episode or whatever it is, and then they go down for a bit, which means that they can then come up, which is very similar to DJing. That you can't just get people dancing faster and faster and faster. So there has to be light and shade. So the shade had to come next for me, and the shade was he's actually shit and he can't write, and we worked, and that was because essentially in hindsight, the sudden attack from the media, it was actually there was darker stuff going on, which I don't know whether I should talk about or not, but people were paid to do it as well. And
let's keep it light. And can we talk about the Renaissance from the dark? Because it strikes me that that's where you really found your métier. You found that there was quality there. You were an artist. You were creative, and you could feed the machine and build the career that you have now. Is that
that's where. So the point so just going back to where we were for a second. So the point that it had to go down, it went down because the music industry had presented the literary industry with a literary figure, and the press considered themselves to be part of the literary establishment. So therefore, you've got a bunch of record people going, look, here's your next literary figure. And they go, fuck you. How dare you? We are the literary people. And I went to wherever, and I'm a journalist, and I'd like to be a poet, and I'm not having this. And so it went very, very nasty.
Yeah.
And for me, with an ego the size of a hot air balloon, which was being inflated daily by the people surrounding me, it was a brutal experience. Poor me, how could they say I was anything other than fabulous? And I was so hurt. I mean, really badly hurt, though. I mean, but yes, so I had to go down, and I went down, and I disappeared, and the EMI deal fell apart, and I walked away from it. I went and bought a wood in Sussex and went and lived there, and didn't write for 2 to 3 years. Couldn't do anything at all. Probably had a nervous breakdown. In fact, I did. Yeah, and dug holes and renovated a Victorian spring system, and put pipes through the ground, and just tried to get as grounded as I could, but it wouldn't work. I mean, I was just in a terrible state. And so the Renaissance came when Mark Rylance called me up and said, would you come and I mean, again, it was just the baby steps of it, from being a real basket case. And Mark called me up and said, would you write a piece for a prologue for The Golden Ass, which we're putting on, and would you perform it? And so I did that, and it didn't feel good. I was on stage in front of a big audience at the Shakespeare's Globe, where I'd done something previously for him and brought the house down, and been an amazing performance. I struggled, but I did okay. And then BBC Saturday, I met a friend of mine, and he said, the problem is you've forgotten how you write. You don't know how you write. And this is a major issue with the sort of 27 issue. And I think most people within literature, by the time they've got to that age, have developed their process. But I think a lot of people who are writing short form, it's the sum total of their childhood, all of the things that have happened to them is blurted out. And when it's gone, and there's no process, and they don't understand the process. So they can't write anymore. And often there's drugs and alcohol involved, which don't help. So for me, I was lucky enough to have a mentor who appeared, and he said, we need to work out how you write. And then we went into a journey into discovering the essence of novelty, which is where all novels and all novel things come from, and all inventions and all ideas come from. And that we worked out was the pushing of two ideas that don't go together. And that is essentially what I'm really good at, and why I'm so good at having brilliant ideas is because I do it naturally. But I'd forgotten that that's what I did. So I did lots of exercises in pushing things together that didn't go together, and it seemed that seemed to trigger some offers coming in. And the next one was from BBC Radio 4 Saturday Live, which had the idea of live writing, that you would write something in the room. And for me, that seemed to work, and I started doing it, and it went well. And I got better at it, and I started remembering how to write. And then from there, I think I really started to learn to be a proper writer at about the age of 30, despite having done whatever I'd done before that. And then came the longer works.
Then came the longer works, which will let people to discover. We don't have that much time left. Can I bring us up to date, Murray? You mentioned right at the top of this that you found lockdown being quite productive. What have you written? And have you got anything you can share with us?
Yes, well, I've in my capacity as resident poet for BBC Six Music, I got together with an old friend whose name is Paul Hartnell, and he went to the same school as me, and he's a sort of techno electronica star with his brother, and they're called Orbital, and I love the idea of writing and having sound backdrops, which I haven't got here. But we did a thing which was responding on a weekly basis to lockdown, and so everything that happened, we did 14 of them, and so each one is responding to whatever happened that week in lockdown. And they started off as poems, and then they mutated, because there was music involved, into spoken word pieces written in songwriting format. And it was a really good thing to be doing. And I have some here, and I've got a couple here. And the first one's called Working from Home. Would you like to hear that?
Please,
So this
Murray.
this just to give you a little bit of context. So this was when we all suddenly said, "Oh shit, this is really happening." And they hadn't announced lockdown, actual lockdown, but there was a flight from the offices. Everyone who needed to be somewhere was going somewhere, and people were still pretty calm, I think. But we'd all started working from home, and this is Working from Home. Hopefully, it'll come up.
Thank you, Murray.
I'm working from home, just me, and being the best I can be. I've done all the tidying now, the washing, the ironing, the what and the how, and I'm texting a bit as I go, and I'm checking the gram with a post just to show that I'm keeping my platform diverse. Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, diverse is the name of the game. I'm a digital nomad. I'm tweaking the frame. There's YouTube to think about too, and it's all about balance. I know this is true, but yes, I'm evolving my role. And I'm more than aware that one can fall down a hole of luxury cars and exploding stars and conspiracy theories and journeys to Mars and then alien life on the moon and Nazis that taught that baboon to drive a miniature submarine to smash all those people to smithereens. But that was way back in the Second World War. I mean, check out this clip. There's just so much more. Ask me anything about Hitler. Ask me anything about Hitler. He died in 1963. Somewhere they say in the Argentina, and there's crop circles, blues, and there's greys, and a wondrous number of ways that when studied, one quickly will find how vinegar benefits the body and mind, and how work is not needed at all, and the secret to life is surrender, and all of the things that we think that we see are just a mirage, and we can all be free to be beautiful creatures of light, to grow wings and take fabulous flight. And if you want to know more, just pick up the phone, let's chat. FaceTime, Zoom, anything. Because I've just started working from home.
Bravo.
That was the first one.
Do you have another one for us?
Well, yeah, sure. I'll just think of a this. Well, I'll give you the second one, and this is when suddenly we were all. You noticed there was that point during lockdown where flour supplies suddenly ran dry, and everyone started baking.
Everybody's making bread,
And
exactly.
it didn't seem that there was any particular sort of social media thing. Everyone just started baking and baking cakes and bread, etc. And at the same time, everybody started jogging because that was the only way we were allowed out of our houses. So this is sort of putting those two things together, which is a classic novelty example: jogging and baking. Yeah, fine, pretty good. It's all about staying busy, baking and jogging. Yes, jogging and baking and sit-ups and baking and reading and baking and chatting to friends, and then jogging and baking and then eating and baking and then going out jogging and to jog off the baking and then getting back home and then going out shopping and queuing, then baking and trying to make sense of the stuff that is happening and baking and jogging and listening to Boris, and then to the people repeat what he's saying over and over in strange newsy voices, and then baking and jogging and trying not to feel gloomy and just wondering where the whole thing is going, and jogging and baking, and then realizing whole generations of people went through so much worse for so much longer, and that was before the invention of jogging, and they didn't have the things that were even needed for baking. So feeling quite grateful for baking and jogging and going to bed and then dreaming of baking and waking each morning and then asking, have it's gone back to normal, and seeing it hasn't. So jogging and baking and baking and jogging and jogging and baking and baking and jogging and jogging and baking and baking and jogging some more.
Bravo. Thank you, Murray.
Thanks.
I mean, can you give us a quick insight? How long do those take? I mean, you perform them like a stand-up comedian. You think it's all coming, straight stream of consciousness, but of course, so much work goes into it. How much work goes into pieces like those?
Well, the interesting thing about these sort of things is that the more work that goes into them, in the sense of the initial creative flow, the more likely they are to be not so good. And I think it's because that's lyrical poetry, and you speak to any lyricist, you speak to Don Black, and he will tell you that the best stuff that he's ever written is the quickest stuff that he's ever written. That doesn't mean that it's finished, but that means you get the transmission is done very, very quickly, and then you go into the edit, and you can do 20 edits if you want. But I'd say the quicker the better in the case of these type of things. But you need a lot of experience to be able to do that.
Yes, quite. And the experience tells you what is and what isn't good, and what to trust and what not to trust, and all that.
Well, I think it's you're coming up. The essential thing is premise, defining principle, beginning, middle, end, payoff line, and making clear that the introduction is there, but trying not to telegraph, I think.
Is that a Murray Lachlan Young masterclass to anybody out there?
and very short.
Very short, exactly. Given the extraordinary career path that you've explained to us so well, would you have done anything differently?
No. And there's a very interesting book called If You Meet Buddha on the Road, Kill Him. and there's a path in that, and I remember reading it and feeling it deeply resonate within me, which is it's a Hebrew thing, and it's the idea that pilgrims go to the Tree of Sorrows, and there's a rabbi there, and they get there and they say, my journey's been so tough, and he says, well, you get to go around the Tree of Sorrows, and from the Tree of Sorrows are hanging everybody else's sorrows, and you can exchange yours for someone who has suffered less if you feel like you want to. And of course, everyone goes around the Tree of Sorrows, and they come back around and they realize that their sorrows are the thing that make them who they are. And so I believe on a wider scale that the past is gone, and I am a sum total of that. And I'm, I like myself a lot more now than I did then.
Which is a delight to hear. The last book you had out was if memory serves, was The Mystery of the Rattlesham Mumps, which was 2018. Have you got another one coming out? What can we look forward to?
Well, there will be another fairly substantial volume of verse coming when I can get it all in one place and send it to my editor. And then I have a new one, which is the piece which is the follow-up to the Rattlesham Mumps, which is another piece for families stroke children, which is called Ifly Snay. and that's going into archetypal Grimm's fairy tale type of land.
And the final question for me, given that you have been locked down, life on the road has stopped, are you looking forward to getting back onto the road?
Not really. I am, but I could do with another few. I could do with my next tour is February next year, and I don't think I'll be doing anything till then. I don't think many people will be, to be quite honest. Street performers might be okay, but yeah, we're all. But for me, I'm very happy to just be doing my thing and writing rather than performing at the moment.
So by February next year, you'll have a clean work slate.
I hope so. I really hope so, actually.
We wish you luck, Murray.
Sorry.
We wish you luck.
Oh, well, thanks.
Murray, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for performing. Good luck with the work slate. And thank you so much just for being so completely honest and open about the entire trajectory of your career. I have to say, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, as it always is. So there you have it, Murray Lachlan Young, explaining how he got to where he is, and which is here, obviously, at the Lockdown LitFest, and the trials and tribulations via a masterclass on how to write like Murray Lachlan Young, and 2 fine examples of his latest work. Murray, thank you for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Stay well, stay safe, and we'll see you next time. Cheerio.